Imagine a nation where the financial story cannot be separated from politics, where every economic rise and collapse has been shaped by revolutions, sanctions, ideology, and survival. That nation is Cuba, a country whose financial history contains moments of brilliance, decades of struggle, and turning points that continue to define the lives of its people today. To understand its present, we must return to the beginning, when Cuba was one of the most dynamic economies in the Caribbean. At the start of the 20th century, Cuba was known as the jewel of the Caribbean. Its economy revolved around sugar, tobacco, and coffee, exported on a massive scale to the United States and Europe. The island enjoyed an urban elite, a modern infrastructure for the era, an active international trade. Foreign banks operated in Havana, and American capital influenced agriculture, tourism, and transportation. But beneath that prosperity lay deep inequality, a heavy dependence on a single commodity, and extreme vulnerability to political shifts. Through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, Cuba experienced cycles of political instability and periods of economic boom. Sugar was the backbone of the nation, but also its fatal weakness. When sugar prices rose, Cuba prospered. When prices fell, the entire system shook. By the late 1950s, economic power was concentrated in a small elite. Seasonal unemployment was constant, and corruption limited development. Into this landscape, the Cuban Revolution exploded. In 1959, Fidel Castro's victory marked the beginning of a radical economic transformation. Within months, the new government nationalized banks, land, sugar mills, factories, utilities, and oil companies. The economy shifted from a mixed model to one fully centralized. The goal was to remove inequality and break dependence on the United States. But the shock was immediate. Capital fled, entire industries collapsed, and the U.S. imposed an embargo. With its biggest trading partner gone, Cuba turned to the Soviet Union. Moscow became its financial lifeline, buying sugar at preferential prices and supplying oil, machinery, and food. For nearly 3 decades, the Cuban economy survived thanks to Soviet subsidies. Central planning dictated production down to the smallest detail: how many liters of milk, how many shoes, how many tons of sugar. In 1970, Cuba attempted an enormous gamble, the 10 million ton Zafra, a harvest meant to achieve a record-breaking output of sugar. Students, soldiers, and workers were mobilized nationwide. Other productive sectors were sacrificed to meet the goal. Ultimately, the target was not reached, and the failure exposed how the economy was subordinated to political goals rather than real capacity. Still, thanks to Soviet support, the system continued functioning. Beneath the surface, however, the model was weakening. Industrial output lagged, agricultural productivity fell, and infrastructure aged. Because subsidies were guaranteed, the government felt no pressure to modernize. But in 1991, everything changed. The collapse of the Soviet Union was an economic earthquake for Cuba. Overnight, the island lost 80% of its foreign trade. Without oil, transportation collapsed. Without fertilizers or machinery, production crashed. Between 1990 and 1993, Cuba's GDP fell by more than 30%. This era became known as the Special Period, a crisis so deep that it defined an entire generation. During the Special Period, daily survival became the central focus of the Cuban economy. Blackouts lasted 12 hours or more. Food shortages were constant. Public transportation collapsed to a point where many walked or used bicycles to cross Havana. The government could no longer sustain the system it had built for decades. And for the first time since 1959, it opened the doors to limited market reforms. In the mid-1990s, Cuba legalized the U.S. dollar, allowed self-employment in selected trades, and authorized small private restaurants. Known as paladeros, tourism became the new lifeline. European and Canadian hotel companies opened joint ventures, bringing foreign currency to the island. Remittances from Cuban families abroad turned into a major revenue source. The country began operating with 2 currencies, the Cuban peso and the convertible peso CUC. The CUC was pegged roughly to the dollar. This dual currency system would define Cuban inequality for decades. But even during these reforms, the state maintained tight control. Most private activity was restricted, and large-scale business remained fully in government hands. The goal was simple: allow just enough market dynamics to survive, without ceding political control. By the 2000s, Cuba's financial landscape changed again. Venezuela, under Hugo Chavez, became a new ally in exchange for Cuban medical personnel, teachers, and advisors. Venezuela supplied heavily subsidized oil. For a time, this arrangement echoed the old Soviet support. Havana regained some breathing room, but once again became dependent on an external partner. Structural problems remained unresolved. Meanwhile, tourism grew into one of the largest sources of income for the country, along with remittances and nickel exports. But inequality deepened. Cubans with access to dollars through tourism jobs or family abroad had far more purchasing power than those paid in pesos. The socialist promise of equality fractured in practice. The 2008 global financial crisis hit Cuba as demand for tourism and nickel dropped. Around the same time, Fidel Castro retired, and Raul Castro introduced new reforms. Small businesses were legalized more broadly. Internet access slowly expanded. Cubans were allowed to buy and sell homes and cars. Farmers gained more autonomy. In 2014, a historic rapprochement with the United States under the Obama administration brought new hope. Increased tourism, diplomatic relations, and a brief opening of the private sector. But this window closed when U.S. policy shifted again, reintroducing restrictions and reducing travel. Tourism fell sharply. Then, in 2019 and 2020, Venezuela's economic crisis dried up oil shipments, and Cuba lost yet another external lifeline. At the same time, internal inefficiencies worsened. State-run enterprises operated at low productivity, bureaucracy slowed all sectors, and Cuba's dependency on imports food, fuel, and basic goods remained severe. By the time the COVID-19 pandemic arrived, the Cuban economy was already fragile. Tourism stopped entirely, remittances were restricted, imports collapsed, blackouts returned, inflation spiked. In 2021, the government eliminated the dual currency system in a reform known as Loteria Ordenamiento. The goal was unification, but the result was widespread inflation and a loss of purchasing power across the entire population. Today, Cuba faces one of the most complex financial situations in its modern history: inflation, currency devaluation, shortages, blackouts, and a mass wave of migration define the national landscape. The private sector has grown, with thousands of small businesses operating legally. But the state still controls the most strategic industries. Tourism is recovering slowly, but far from pre-pandemic levels. The island's economy continues to be shaped by external shocks, internal inefficiencies, and political decisions that prioritize control over growth. Yet beneath the hardship lies one of the most important lessons of Cuba's financial history. Politics can shape an economy for decades. In Cuba, ideology determined production, distribution, investment, and trade. Global alliances substituted for internal development. Every economic rise came from an external partner. Every collapse came when that partner disappeared. The result is a nation that has survived but not prospered. Cuba's financial story is not just about money. It is about how political power can redefine markets, restructure entire societies, and determine who thrives and who suffers. Understanding this history is essential to understanding the Cuba of today, a nation still fighting to reconcile its ideals with economic reality. Cuba's current financial landscape is the cumulative result of a century of political shifts, external dependencies, and internal choices. What makes the Cuban case so unique is not simply the presence of economic hardship, but the predictability of its cycles. Periods of survival fueled by outside support, followed by deep crises when that support disappears. The island's economy has never been shaped solely by markets. It has been shaped by geopolitics. Today, Cuba's monetary crisis reflects decades of structural imbalance. The country produces too little and imports too much. Agriculture remains weak. forcing the nation to buy most of its food from abroad. Manufacturing is outdated. Tourism, once the main hope for revenue, now competes against global instability and shifting travel restrictions. And the local currency continues to lose value, creating a vicious circle of inflation and scarcity. The government has allowed the private sector to expand more than at any point since 1959, creating small and medium-sized enterprises known as MIPIMEs. These businesses now play a central role in providing food, services, and supplies that the state can no longer guarantee, but they face limits, restricted imports, lack of raw materials, high taxes, and a banking system that cannot support growth. As a result, the private sector grows in a fragmented and inconsistent way that the state can no longer guarantee, but they face limits, restricted imports, lack of raw materials, high taxes, and a banking system that cannot support growth. As a result, the private sector grows in a fragmented and inconsistent way. Meanwhile, ordinary Cubans face the daily consequences: long lines for basic goods, salaries that do not match inflation, and a reliance on informal markets to survive. Families depend on remittances from abroad more than ever. The black market for currency has become a parallel financial system. Those who receive dollars or euros have access to food, medicine, and transportation. Those paid in pesos struggle to meet even basic needs. This dual reality has deepened inequality in a system designed to eliminate it. The socialist promise of fairness has collided with the modern realities of scarcity and global integration. Cuba is no longer a centralized economy, nor is it a market economy. It exists in a hybrid space, where ideology and necessity are constantly negotiating the future. Political decisions continue to shape the country's financial path. The embargo imposed by the United States remains a significant barrier to trade, investment, and access to global markets. At the same time, many of Cuba's internal restrictions and policies limit innovation, productivity, and entrepreneurship. The combination of external pressure and internal control creates an economic environment where progress is slow and fragile. Yet, despite the challenges, the Cuban people have demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Innovation emerges in unexpected ways: urban farming, family-owned restaurants, independent digital creators, informal transportation networks, and small businesses that find ways to overcome shortages. These efforts reveal a truth repeated throughout Cuban history: when the system fails, individuals adapt. Cuba's future will depend on how it balances political control with economic reality. Will the government allow deeper reforms? Will external alliances shift once again? Will the private sector be given the space it needs to grow? And most importantly, will the island break the cycle of dependency that has shaped its past? The financial history of Cuba is more than a timeline. It is a story of survival, ideology, resistance, and reinvention. It shows how politics can build an economy and how politics can break it. It is the story of a nation caught between past promises and future possibilities. What remains clear is this: Cuba's economic challenges cannot be understood without understanding its political backbone, and its political story cannot be understood without recognizing how money, power, and ideology have shaped each other for generations. Cuba's history reminds us that the economy is never just numbers. It is people, families, dreams, and struggles. It is the invisible force that shapes daily life, opportunity, and hope. If this gave you a new perspective on Cuba's financial story, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Let's Talk About Money, share this video, and hit the like button. It costs nothing, and it helps us reveal the truth behind how money and power really work. Because understanding history isn't just knowledge, it is financial power.